Too many investors were being pushed into EB-5 projects without a thought, without somebody who is standing by their side. So today's conversation is going to be something very different, not something that we are going to cover out of the brochure. What is the one thing that people will not recognize looking at your LinkedIn profile?
There's an immigrant story in my own family. I hold an Irish passport. My father's father immigrated to the United States in the 1930s, and that experience heavily influenced me. I know what it means to uproot. I know what it means to move to another country and start something new.
Not everybody who's applying for an EB-5 is a millionaire. It's really hard-earned money, and people who are saving for their kids, families.
What I like about, frankly, Quantum, what I like about working with partners who are sophisticated, who know what they're looking at, is that they know what to ask. Everyone is lying until proven otherwise. Our very first EB-5 investor made a bet on us. We had not done 50 projects, and we did not have the track record that we have today.
Every regional center, every project that we look at, it's the same cut, copy, paste on all brochures. But there is something completely different when we look beyond the brochure. And it's a different story with everything. Hello everyone, I'm Rashika, CEO of Quantum Global. If you're here, you are exploring EB-5 or you're already in the thick of it. Either way, welcome. I started Quantum Global because I saw a huge gap. Too many investors were being pushed into EB-5 projects without a thought, without somebody who is standing by their side. In the last year alone, Quantum has advised many families across India, the UAE, and the Southeast Asia. What matters to me more than the numbers is being radically honest. Because EB-5 isn't just a visa, it's a serious capital decision. And you deserve a partner who treats it that way. I'm not an immigration attorney. I'm not a regional center. I sit between both the worlds as your sounding board, your advocate, and your referee. When I do choose to work with a regional center, it's because I've done the deep work. I have understood what exactly their capital stack is, their repayment track record, and the people behind the project. And that is exactly why I wanted to take this publicly. And today, I'm joined by someone who I deeply respect in the EB-5 space, the CEO of Civitas Capital Group, Dan Healy.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for your time, and I'm eternally grateful for it.
Likewise.
So today's conversation is going to be something very different, not something that we are going to cover out of the brochure, but what exactly investors want to know and are actually worried about. So before I deep dive into EB-5 and the serious stuff, I want to ask you, what is the one thing that people will not recognize looking at your LinkedIn profile?
Well, one thing that's not obvious on my profile is that there's an immigrant story in my own family. I hold an Irish passport. My father's father and mother immigrated to the United States in the 1930s. And that experience heavily influenced my father, my parents, as well as me. So EB-5 for me is a business. It's a series of rules, a program, but it's also something that's very emotional in the sense that I know what it means to uproot. I know what it means to move to another country and start something new, and I really appreciate the trust and the confidence that our investors place in us, in that way.
That's a really emotional one. So obviously, more than the business, it's actually you're caring about the investors.
Exactly, and as you said in your introduction, for any individual, the capital investment is very significant. For some people, they may have been fortunate to accrue wealth where they can, relatively easily afford it. But for many, this is a major capital commitment. Good. In addition, to the sort of arduous process of, immigrating and moving your family and making all those plans. In addition to the actual EB-5 process itself. So it's a lot. And so yes, we take it very seriously.
Correct. This is actually something that I say to my investors also. Not everybody who's applying for an EB-5 is a millionaire. It's really hard-earned money, and people who are saving for their families.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly, like I said, we've seen many investors, many clients over the years who have plenty of capital. But we've also seen many families who are, pooling their resources to make something happen for their children that, is life-changing.
Correct. Thank you for sharing your personal story with us.
Absolutely.
But before I deep dive into projects and legal matters, there is one story that I want to share with everybody who's looking at this podcast today. So while we were doing our internal diligence at Quantum, Rishabh, your Asia head, mentioned a video of Civitas' first investor journey. I can see you smiling there. Yeah.
Yes, I know
Which
this
is
video.
confirmed by our mom. And the emotion that Rishabh said it with, me and my team, we were only of that one thought, saying that this team actually cares about much more beyond money. It's about enriching lives. And that's one thing that has stayed with us.
Well, that makes me very happy to hear. The investor you're referring to is Manuel Arenas, our very first EB-5 investor. And at that time, we had not been doing this for 15 years, and we had not, done 50 projects, and we did not have the track record that we have today. What we had was a business plan and the right experience, but mostly I think we had the right approach. The confidence that Manuel had to invest with us at that time was, at least partially unearned. I mean, he made a bet on us, and it was very, very important to me, to my co-founder, Rafael, that we deliver.
Correct. I mean, it always matters about the first person who invests in you, right? That trust, that emotional capabilities also. So I actually want to start there. So was it intentional? Did you set up to start a regional center with passion behind the numbers or passion behind the emotions, or did it organically grow over the years?
It's a little of both. On the front end, my background is institutional investments, so very much diligence oriented, about the numbers. We're very good at that. That's what everyone on the investment side of Civitas came out of. But when I started the company with Rafael, the opportunity I actually learned about from my mother. My mother is a 30-plus year immigration attorney who finally recently retired, thank goodness. I was trying to get her to stop working for way too long. But at the time, she was representing, among other clients, the city of Dallas. This was in 2008, right after Lehman Brothers had gone under and the financial crisis was really sort of kicking off in earnest. And at the time, I was the junior partner in a real estate investment firm that I had helped to start. And I thought, we weren't going to be doing any new investments for a while because there was no liquidity, there was no capital in the market for what we did, which was, multifamily development joint ventures.
Okay.
And I just happened to be having coffee with my mother, and she told me she had been hired by the city of Dallas, and they were ahead of the curve in trying to figure out how EB-5 could be an economic development tool for the city. And, I had a lot of free time on my hands, at the time. So I did some homework, I did some research, and it started with the numbers. It started with, hey, if there was a way to pool this capital, we could probably deploy it into really high quality opportunities that otherwise wouldn't get done because there's no other liquidity in the market. But what really made it fun, what really made it attractive was pooling capital from people who were looking to change their lives, as opposed to institutions like insurance companies and other pensions, that kind of thing, who are looking to earn returns, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's a lot more fun to accomplish the objectives of EB-5 investors than to accomplish the objectives of insurance companies.
Correct. It's about enriching lives.
Right. Exactly. That is our core purpose at Civitas.
So I want to bring it back a little bit. So Civitas and Quantum, we've had multiple conversations offline. But there's one thing that I've always been wondering. Do you think there is a little bit something off with respect to EB-5 marketing? Because every regional center, every project that we look at, it's the same cut, copy, paste on all brochures. But there is something completely different when we look beyond the brochure. And it's a different story with everything. So what do you feel about that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, again, coming from the institutional world, we never accept anything that anyone tells us. I mean, it's just the truth. One of my colleagues, my business partner, who's also president and chief investment officer at Civitas, Jonathan Kern, has a considerably deeper institutional background than I do, even, and his role in the firm, among other things, is to be the resident skeptic. Everyone is lying until proven otherwise.
Absolutely.
And so that's just the way we have to start with things. It imposes discipline that, frankly, we had to learn. This wasn't something that was just obvious from the beginning to me. So the brochure is a good starting point. It's fine. But what I like about, frankly, Quantum, what I like about working with partners who are sophisticated, who know what they're looking at, is that they know what to ask, and we've been through it all. So we have the answers, but it's not always something, the technicalities are not something you want to lead with in the brochure necessarily, because people don't necessarily understand it right off the bat. They need some guidance. So it's very gratifying when that happens.
Yeah. So it's okay to look at the brochure to just understand and get the cream of the knowledge, but obviously looking at it.
Yeah, it's always the 30,000-foot view. That's the purpose of it, is just to get a basic understanding of what the major points are. But it should never stop there.
Correct. Also, Civitas has chosen a very conservative, more like a quiet-like structure towards marketing, because what I see from other regional centers are usually chasing the headlines. But you have built quietly and carefully all through that. So why is it that there is a conservative approach?
Well, there's a few reasons. It starts, I think, at the core in our culture, because everyone comes out of the institutional world. It's not a retail-oriented marketing mindset. We had to learn how to do that. So I think, we have many times been much more conservative than, the market on what we're willing to say publicly, the things that we're willing to advertise publicly. Some of that has to do with also our regulatory posture is a little different from most of the EB-5 regional center operators that are around. We're a registered investment advisor with the Securities and Exchange Commission in the U.S., which means that we're subject to certain rules that other people are not subject to. That's something that we have in place because our business historically has been broader than just EB-5. We've had other types of investments that have required us to be registered. So that puts some constraints on us as well.
Correct. I was just going to come to that because you're one of the very few regional centers who are SEC regulated. While most of the investors do not grasp as to what that means, the compliance is much more. So if you could just throw some light for the investors who are hearing this, for them to understand what does this exactly compile of.
Sure. And I have to be careful here because it's very important to understand that just the fact of being registered doesn't actually mean anything in itself.
Correct.
It's actually illegal for me to imply otherwise. Okay. So I have to be very clear about that. But you are right. It does impose some base requirements, that we're subject to that, others would not be. For example, we're required to audit all of our investment vehicles annually. Absent registration, we would not necessarily have to do that, as an example. Sort of more broadly, it's important for investors to understand that whether a regional center or an issuer of an EB-5, partnership interest is registered with the commission or not, regardless, they're required to comply with securities laws. In that sense, there's really no difference. Where a difference does come in is the kinds of record keeping that we have to do, some of the restrictions on marketing and communications that don't otherwise apply to us. So that's really where the rubber hits the road.
But that's actually very good for investors, right? Because they have an additional layer of security.
Yeah. And they know, by merely the fact of our registration means that we are subject to these requirements, and therefore they can ask how we comply with them. And we have the records and the information to demonstrate that.
Correct.
Because we have to demonstrate it to the government whenever they ask.
Yes. No, this is actually very helpful, because what also happens is when I speak to the investors on a daily, they do not really understand what exactly this entails. And coming it from you, obviously, this makes a lot of sense to them. Yeah. So now let's take a step beyond just the projects. Let's talk about leadership, vision, and the person behind Civitas. So you have led Civitas through its curves, COVID, and re-authorities. So what is that one thing that this whole journey has taught you as a CEO, just beside the EB-5, but leadership under pressure?
Well, there's not. It's hard to pick one thing, because there have been many lessons. One thing that comes to mind though easily is that when I started, we started over 15 years ago now. I thought of myself as an investment professional, that was starting an EB-5 regional center business, right? Today, I think of myself as a leader who's responsible for building a team of people who are better than I am in every way. So I'm in the people picking business. I'm in the partner picking business. Today, I spend, a fairly small minority of my time actually getting into the weeds of the underwriting of a loan, for example, okay? Because I have Jonathan and Austin Kahn and their team who are better than I'm ever going to be at doing that. So I have the benefit, the privilege of, getting the result of weeks or months of work and going over that instead of going over it from the beginning, the way I did for years, for 10 plus years. So that's really the toughest part, is learning to trust the team and let go of the things that I'm good at it. Don't get me wrong, but they're better.
Okay. But you have a great eye for talent then.
I like to think so. I'm proud of our track record.
So when you zoom out from the whole vision, what do you envision Civitas to be in the next 10 to 15 years?
In the next 10 to 15 years, really, a little bit of context for you. In the last 3 years, we have really dramatically narrowed our focus in on EB-5 because we think it's a great growth opportunity. Historically, our volume, was at a certain level, and post Integrity Act, we have grown quite a bit. So, you mentioned marketing earlier, for example. We're now getting into markets and channels, that are new for us. That historically the volume that we were doing, frankly, we just didn't really need to. Now we do. So, I guess in the call it the 5-year time frame, I am most focused on making sure that the EB-5 program is reauthorized and that we continue to make progress on the policy front in Washington to improve and expand its capacity. If we're successful in that, we will grow our investment volume dramatically, and that's really the goal in that 10-year time frame.
So, also you are managing a global firm across time zones and doing it with precision. I'm usually fascinated by this, and I'm curious to understand if there is a personal habit or any philosophy that helps you stay grounded through this all.
it goes back to the people and trust. You know, in order to do what we do, it's funny when I talk to people about this business. It's such a narrow little niche business. You know, in for example, the real estate capital market is whatever it is, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars. You know, the amount that is attributable to EB-5 is like a rounding error, but it's such a complex, you know, intersection of law and finance and, you know, all of these disciplines. And that's what makes it fun. That's what makes it, you know, interesting to me. But it also means that we have to have really excellent people across a range of disciplines that have to be, you know, working together. And so going back, I think, to the question you asked me previously, what I've had to learn to do is, you know, build teams, instill trust in me and trust, you know, my people, trust our process. And that doesn't necessarily come naturally to me. I had to be trained. You know, I had to learn how to do that.
Yeah, letting go.
Yeah. We use a system called the Entrepreneurial Operating System, EOS. It's what we run on internally. And in EOS training, they call it letting go of the vine. It's a good metaphor because that's what it feels like. But it works.
That's exactly the thing that I'm trying to learn these days, letting go. Yeah. So I have to say there are a few of my investors have actually visited your Dallas office, and they have extremely good things to say, especially how it's intentionally designed. So I've been meaning to visit, but when I do, so what is the one thing that you feel that I should do in Dallas?
Other than visit our awesome office, yeah, I am very proud of it. My wife's brother and his wife are architects who have their own firm. They designed this office for us, so it's very much a reflection of who we are and our values. So I will definitely look forward to giving you the nickel tour and kind of explain to you how that comes through. But you know, for me, if you're gonna come in, you need to come in during football season so we can go to a game, because it's the Dallas Cowboys are a cultural institution, in addition to just being a lot of fun. So if you want to get a sense of the real America, going to a Cowboys game is a good way to start.
So I've heard from you now. Yeah. So coming to food, so what is your go-to joint?
Well, Texas is you can eat very well in Dallas. I mean, it's one of the sort of real advantages that we have. The breadth and depth of the restaurant and food scene is really impressive. But I'm a pretty simple guy, and one of my go-to places is Bob's Steak and Chop. You know, Dallas is definitely a steak town, and everybody has their place. Bob's is a pretty old school kind of vibe. You know, it's very sort of family oriented, but it's also where you'll see people, you know, meeting after work to talk business or whatever, but you'll see, you know, somebody taking their son or daughter there for graduation. You know, it's my kind of place.
It's a very family oriented and a nice place then.
Yeah.
So taking this on a more personal level, so how has your childhood shaped up to be the leader that you are today?
Wow.
Were there any values maybe, or?
Well, certainly. I mean, you know, my parents both came from very large families. So my father was one of 7 and my mother was one of 14. So I have a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins. And, you know, they're both from the East Coast. So they both grew up, you know, fast, you know, when they were kids. So they had a lot of responsibility for their siblings at an early age, and that came through to me. I had a lot of expectation of independence early on. And at the time, I didn't really realize that that's what was happening. But, you know, now that I have a 21-year-old and a 17-year-old of my own, they've had a very different experience. So, you know, I benefited from that in many ways. But it also, created a lot of challenges, a lot of, blind spots that I didn't know I had that I had to, figure out, once I became a dad.
Correct. So, but that the values have shaped up to building your team today also.
Oh, yes. I mean, I worked for my father for several years. Everything I sort of brought to the business to becoming an entrepreneur, I learned from him. All through high school and college, I had planned to be a lawyer. Both of my parents are lawyers. My wife is a lawyer. And I got all the way to law school at the University of Chicago before I spoke to some actual lawyers who were doing what it was I thought I was, preparing for, and realized that, that wasn't for me. But part of the reason I got that far is that the expectation, the focus on education, the focus on trying to subordinate my ego to, actually to a solution to the problem, even if it's not my idea. That's something I learned from them that I definitely take into everything I try. I try to take it in everything I do at the firm. And I think it's something that the culture that Raphael and I have built over the last 15 years reflects that, among other things.
Thank you for sharing such a personal story with me.
Absolutely.
So finally, you keep visiting China and across Asia.
Sure.
So what is the one thing that has changed your worldview with respect to investor psychology?
Investor psychology. Well, I tell people, if you haven't been to China, if you haven't been to Dubai, if you haven't been to these, parts of the world, you really cannot grasp it online fully. You can see pictures, you can read about it, but you really cannot grasp what's happening, the scale of what's happening, the speed at which it's happening, without experiencing it. And so, I obviously, being an American, growing up in America, I have a good sense of what it means to live there, to be there, what the culture is. But I had completely underestimated how jarring, just how different, it can be, and just what it takes, to decide, I'm in, Hyderabad, I'm going to move, or I'm going to move my family. I mean, that's a big deal. Frankly, escaping, poverty in Ireland, is one thing, but making a choice when you have a choice, is another. So that helped me, really open my eyes to, some of the thought processes that go into the decisions that our clients make.
Because it's obviously a very emotional decision, moving families, and there are sometimes that investors are doing it only for their kids because the kids are already starting there and then doing an EB-5 for them. And given the recent situations, yes, the number has gone higher.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when Quantum Global onboarded a couple of projects, one thing that stood out to me was the resilience of Civitas. Despite the volatility of EB-5 space and the talks in the program being ended, one thing that actually stood out was the non-EB-5 side of Civitas. And not many investors know about this, but I've had the opportunity of knowing that in greater detail. So what is it, if you can throw some light on that, as to how the non-EB-5 side impacts the EB-5 side overall?
I guess I can sum it up by saying I like to tell people that we're professional investors who are involved in EB-5. We did not start in EB-5. And the reason, not many people know, but in 2019, just before COVID, as it turned out, that was also, there was a lot of uncertainty about the future of EB-5 at that point in Washington, because there had been a series of very short-term reauthorizations. And it wasn't clear that the regional center program, as it had, has existed, was going to continue to exist in that form. And we made a decision at that time to just stop doing new EB-5 investments until there was a a reauthorization long term. So we didn't do any new EB-5 investments from mid 2019 through after the Integrity Act, so 2022. So almost 3 full years. So the reason we were able to do that was twofold. One was that, our EB-5 business had, fortunately for us, been established. So, we had quite a bit to manage. But the other was that we were doing other investments, making other, on behalf of other types of investors. And that's been an important part of our evolution as a firm, of our growth as a firm. So for the most part, those investments are in the same asset classes, the same areas. We focus on U.S. commercial real estate, primarily multifamily residential, as well as hotels. Those are our 2 largest, most common asset types, although we occasionally invest in other real estate assets. And that has, been a great, both a hedge, in terms of the EB-5 program's volatility, as well as, created good opportunities to earn returns. But at our core, EB-5 is in our DNA. That's what we started the firm around. And the non-EB-5 business is complementary. It's designed to be a complement to that as opposed to the core.
Understood. So would it be right to say that the due diligence that you do for both the sides, non-EB-5 and EB-5 side, based on the due diligence is when you decide as to where it should be aggregated?
Not really. No, actually. It's because it's the same people. So we have one investment team, whether they're investing capital on behalf of EB-5 investors, or if they're investing capital on behalf of a family office or an insurance company or another institutional partner of ours. It's the same people, the same process. That's what I mean by it's institutional quality, because it's the same underwriting process that Goldman Sachs has signed off on, that every one of our individual EB-5 investors is getting the benefit of. So it's not about what we do is we have a mandate, based on the investor's need. So if I have an EB-5 investor from a particular market that has a particular preference, we go find things that work, that fit that preference, and that meet our criteria and standards for investment quality and whatnot. Similarly, we have had mandates with institutional investors that have been everything from very, very conservative loan syndications, where we're making a senior loan on a 100% leased commercial building where there's just not a lot of volatility, not a lot of risk, not a lot of return, and that's fine because that's what they're looking for. On the other end of the spectrum, we recently did an investment that's a new construction multifamily development in California. That has a very different risk profile, a very different return profile, because that's what that investor is looking for. So we really build it around what's the investor's strategy, then we go execute, as opposed to the other way around.
Understood. So being a private equity first and then a regional center, so how does that exactly change the overall looking towards a project?
So one way is that because we vertically integrate those 2 functions, right? We're an investment manager and we also own and operate regional centers. When we create an EB-5 offering, it's helpful. It eliminates the possibility of a misalignment between those roles, because we're doing both. So there's no way for us to be misaligned with ourselves, as opposed to, it is possible when you have, and this is why we don't rent or just do cooperation agreements for our regional centers with third parties where we're not involved in the investment. We don't do that because of the potential for that misalignment. Because if I have an investment over here that I'm getting, a fee, for them to use our regional center, but I don't control that investment. If they have a problem, it can be a problem for me, of course, but it can more importantly be a problem for all the other investors in that regional center potentially. And that's just not a risk we're going to take. So that's probably the most important sort of point to make there.
Got it. So what's the one thing about EB-5 marketing that you wish investors would ask before actually investing?
Well, let me think for a minute. I think one thing that investors should always ask is, how do you lose money? How do you lose money in this investment? What are the top 3 risks? Because if an investment manager cannot immediately articulate for you the top 3 risks of an investment, then they haven't done their work. Because there's no such thing as a risk-free investment. You can have low risk, you cannot have risk-free. Anybody who's been in the investment business for any length of time has had a problem. Investors should always ask anyone they're considering trusting with their money, what were the last problem or 2 that you dealt with, and what happened? How did you handle them? Anybody who's been around long enough to have survived COVID, for example, what happened to your EB-5 investments in COVID? That's a good question to ask.
That's right. It also throws light as to how did they actually tackle that situation, and being honest, brutally honest with the investors help.
Yeah. And if there's transparency and trust, especially when you're talking about touching someone else's money, but in any relationship, is paramount. So you either have it or you don't. And if there's not a good sense, if there's not a good, a feeling of rapport, but actual information, actual data, one of the nice things is that now there are a lot of resources for investors. They don't have to do this themselves.
Correct.
They don't have to do it by themselves. And I encourage, all of our investors. I always tell people, look, there's no question you're going to come up with that Goldman Sachs has not yet come up with for us. Ask anything. Hire Goldman Sachs and have them ask. People do that. We welcome it because we want people to feel confident. Yeah. When someone makes an investment with us, you're talking about 5, 6 plus years. This is a long relationship. We need to be confident in one another.
Correct. And this is exactly, I think, we at Quantum Global do the complete due diligence. Actually, what happened, this is an interesting story. We usually cover around 45 to 50 questions for a particular project when we onboard. And only if it passes.
I'm pretty sure you asked us more than that.
Yes, I was just coming there. For the Hawaii project, we have collectively more than 95 questions. And honestly, kudos to your team. They were really patient enough and answered at the right time. And most of our investors, I think the numbers spoke for itself there.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, but frankly, that is the standard. That is what we require of Austin and Jonathan and our investment team is that, and I have no hesitation at all in putting them up against any institutional, lending team, institutional underwriting team in the market. That's the confidence that we want our investors to have.
I think transparency and accountability.
That's the goal.
In a space where guarantees are impossible, what does integrity look like?
Well, integrity, you're right. Guarantees are illegal, actually, in this, or at least, guaranteeing performance. Integrity goes back to transparency and trust. It's very easy for there to be a positive, smooth relationship when everything's going great. When there are no problems, you learn who you're really dealing with when there's a problem. And there's always something, maybe a small problem, sometimes a major problem, a COVID level problem. And you learn who you're dealing with when that happens. And so for me, integrity means being straightforward and honest, when problems come up, and including about what you're doing, to address them. But also sometimes it's out of your hands, or sometimes, it requires the government or some third party to do something. And, all we can do is work through it together. And that's a very frustrating experience for investors. And unfortunately, it's just in the nature of EB-5 that happens from time to time. When it does, we want to be the best resource that we can be. And I think we've shown that. But one of the things I think is really important for investors to understand going into this process is that it's arduous, and there can be, elements that are unpredictable. And we just have to be straight about that.
Yeah, being brutally honest again. Yeah, I feel. So are there any systems that you have institutionalized at Civitas to prevent emotional decisions?
Yes.
Because there's a fiduciary duty also along with the emotional decisions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's, I guess the answer to this could be fairly long. I'll try to limit it. One of the things that we're really big on at Civitas is process. We try to minimize the number of decisions that have to be made. When there's a draw on a construction loan, for example, there's a process. We don't have to decide each time how we're going to, evaluate the information. There's a process for doing that. It's written down. People are trained on it. That's one example among many. How we move money from place to place, account to account, funding a draw, making a distribution to an investor. All of those things are subject to a process. So one way that you avoid emotional or just, absent-minded, whatever it may be, decision-making is to reduce as many things to standard process as possible. That's very important to us. At kind of the next level, you get to real investment decision-making, which can also be emotional. When you have a threat to an investment, something's not working the way it was supposed to be, or there's a cost overrun, it is easy to get angry. It's easy, and I get angry. I mean, everyone, you can't avoid it.
Absolutely.
But you, again, have to have a process for making these decisions where they're, deliberated, reviewed, then you pull the trigger, sort of measure twice, cut once. And it's a simple concept, but it is not always the easiest to implement. And I have certainly learned enough lessons the hard way.
I think that's a sign of growing.
I hope so.
Yeah. So if you had to give a new EB-5 investor one gut check to ask regional centers within like 60 seconds, what would that be?
Well, the first one would be, don't try to evaluate anything in 60 seconds.
I know, that's where we come in, to try to simplify things.
Right. That would be the first one. Beyond that, I guess it would be take your time. Don't be rushed. Do your homework. Talk to people. Don't take my word or any one person's word for anything on, the quality or whether it's the right fit for you. It's important that investors, again, start a relationship with a regional center that is going to be, a multi-year relationship that's going to work. It's important. So take the time.
Understood. But given the recent situations in the US right now, there are too many F1, H1B holders who are in the nick of time to close on EB-5. So how should they evaluate a project when the time sensitivity is in picture?
Then when you have that kind of time pressure, it's that much more important. And frankly, Civitas has been the beneficiary of what I'll call a flight to quality, in that sense. Track record matters. Longevity matters. We are going to be here next year and the following year, and we've shown that. We've done this. We've done 50 plus EB-5 investments at this point. So, obviously I have a bias, but, if you have to narrow things down quickly, starting with, those who have deep experience is a good way to start in just as a general matter, EB-5 or otherwise. Beyond that, I think relying on, not trying to do it yourself, getting the right advisors who've been there and done that and can help you quickly, evaluate what's important about a particular EB-5 investment from your or that investor's particular perspective. If they're an H-1B that's already in the United States, they have a different set of needs than, someone who is, in Bangalore, like we were talking about. those things are not always obvious, but there are experts who can, help you quickly evaluate that.
Yeah. The right people to actually get acquainted with. Yeah. When I say right, then there are a number of definitions for the right.
Right.
Yeah. So as an experienced CEO, I deeply respect the weight of decisions that you have to take on a daily basis. So when capital protection and immigration success is pulling you on either sides, how do you look at a investor?
Well, fortunately, in our history, we have never actually had that conflict. And that is not a coincidence. We do our very best to structure on the front end every EB-5 investment to minimize the likelihood that we would have to choose between accomplishing the immigration objective and taking or minimizing or losing money or taking financial risk. The objective is always to keep those things aligned. And fortunately, even when we've had problems, and we've had problems, over the years, they have not been immigration problems because the job creation and meeting all of the other requirements was built in on the front end. So that's how we do that. And, God willing, we'll continue to be successful in that sense. Okay. Now, as a hypothetical, if we did actually face, the conflict, 10 times out of 10, when I've had this conversation with an investor or with, an advisor, the immigration objective takes precedence, and that's what our documents say. Our documents make clear that in the event that we have to make a decision where there could be a conflict, we will prioritize meeting the immigration requirements. Fortunately, we haven't had to do that.
That's great. So one thing that we are trying to do at Quantum Global is to set a standard for accountability for EB-5. So you, as the CEO and who has experienced EB-5 for a very, very long time now, what is that one thing that you think that as an advisor, I should be doing it for the investor? Actually, you have not seen, but you think that they should be doing it.
Well, let me think for a second. I think advisors to investors, it's interesting because coming from the U.S. from a regulated background, these words mean something different to me than they may mean in other contexts, right? So from an investment perspective, it's about either having the advisor, him or herself, having the requisite expertise or having access to it, and knowing how to access it and how to apply it. That, I would say, is inconsistent, in this market. The same, I guess, could conceptually be said for the immigration side, but to be honest, I expect an advisor to really have deep knowledge. They don't have to be a lawyer, but frankly, the people who really know what they're doing in this business know how EB-5 works as well or better than most of the lawyers. That's my view, and that's in my opinion, a relatively small number of people. There are a lot of people who are salespeople, and that's fine. That has a role. But if you're holding yourself as an advisor to someone, that has to mean something.
Correct. But that's a powerful statement wherein the advisors know a lot more than immigration attorneys sometimes. Yeah,
they can. It's like anything, EB-5, even within the immigration field, EB-5 is a specialized niche. There are not that many general immigration practitioners who do a lot of EB-5. There are some, but many immigration attorneys that do EB-5 specialize in it because it is, a specialty.
Correct. So when we were evaluating your projects at QG, what stood out to us was how you handled previous downturns. So I think the investors deserve to hear how a firm believes or behaves under pressure. And how do you honestly communicate the information in case of a downturn?
Sure. So I'll give you an example. We invest in hotels, right? We lend EB-5 capital to build hotels. In COVID, the U.S. hotel market, the entire market, went from stabilization to 5% occupancy, in a matter of a few weeks. So an unprecedented disaster. What do you do when you have a loan on a project that one day is moving along fine and towards stabilization, and then the next day is empty? What what do you do with that? Well, the first thing that we were able to do, which is what I'm maybe most proud of, is that we relied on our downside underwriting on the front end, meaning that we weren't in a position where our loan was very high leverage, even though there was no cash flow to pay debt service once COVID hit, and it was totally unclear whether there ever would be. We were able to work out an interim forbearance, while COVID was sort of working itself out, but we were prepared to own the asset. If we needed to own the asset ourselves, operate it ourselves, that's the skill set that we have. That's the downside underwriting that we're looking at with every project on the front end. We don't lend money on anything that we're not prepared to own at that loan basis. And in one case, it almost came to that. We came very close to taking this project back from the borrower. At the last minute, they decided to pay us off, and we were able to recover every dime that we were owed, which was a great outcome for our investors, but far from a certain one. I mean, there was a lot of ups and downs before we got to that point. So again, it's very easy to have a good experience when you're not having any issues. You learn how prepared your regional center is when there's a serious issue. And that's where we shine. Fortunately, we haven't had to shine very often to that degree. But what allows me to sleep at night is that I know that we are prepared, for come what may.
So do you think the private equity side actually plays a larger role in these situations if they arise at Civitas?
Yes and no. It's important to understand that there's no side.